And joining us now on the brink is Mr. Daryl Joseph. Good evening, Mr. Joseph. Welcome to On the Brink.
Good evening, Doctor. Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago and the listening public. Glad to be here.
So Mr. Joseph is a certified employee assistant professional. He is the director of Josal Consulting Limited and the Trinidad and Tobago EAP Association president. Thank you again for being here. Mr. Joseph, what advice, having heard that traumatizing story from our ICU survivor, there is indeed hope because he came out of the ICU, but what advice would you share to his family as they cope with the loss of the sister-in-law that succumbed to COVID-19?
Well, the first thing I do is to offer my sincerest condolences. Those words, of course, they don't change anything, but it's still an act of sincerity in terms of offering empathy and understanding of what you're going through. What the family needs to understand, and just about anybody who is going through the grieving process right now, is that grieving is just that. It's a process. It's not a destination that you just arrive at suddenly just like that. It's also important to understand that each person's process of grieving is unique. The journey is unique from each person. Moving through grieving is like moving from being in, if you could imagine the scene that causes grief as being like a movie. It's like going from being in the scene to watching it from a safe distance emotionally. So the impact is still there to an extent, but not as severely as it was before. It's important to acknowledge grief, not to run away from it. But at the same time, there are some hidden gems inside of grief if you can process it correctly and if you can get around it. And one of the things that grief can do, if you're able to process it correctly, is that it's a reminder of how little we have control of and how much we have to embrace each day, embrace the people around us, embrace the things that are really important to us, and live each day not knowing exactly what tomorrow will bring.
That sometimes could be a little bit of a scary thought, not knowing what tomorrow can bring. We're living right now in a situation locally and globally where trauma is part of our everyday conversation. I've read in a couple researches that trauma can indeed impact us at a DNA level. How does trauma impact a person?
That is correct. Well, trauma, understanding what trauma is, it's an emotional response, but it's an emotional response to death or a very, very serious threat of death that can cause not only emotional impacts and effects, but also physical effects as well. You mentioned, for example, about, we talk about, there's an ongoing body of research going on into the impact of trauma. And one of the interesting areas that researchers are looking at is the actual impact of trauma on a person's DNA and the ability of that impact to be felt not just with the person who experienced the trauma, but the children also of the person who experienced that trauma. So we're talking very, very serious things. We're talking about an emotional response that includes things like flashbacks, uncontrollable emotions. It can even strain your relationships. And as I mentioned before, physical symptoms like headache and nausea. And people may have heard of a more severe form of trauma, which is called PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. That is where a person, they're so traumatized that they experience recurring flashbacks of the event, intrusive memories, and this can be so difficult to manage that it can actually be disruptive to a person's life. They may not be able to function, go back to work and live as normal because of the effect, the severe effect of trauma. So trauma is a very, very serious and a very real thing that affects a lot of people in our society. I would say more than we acknowledge or more than we know.
A very recent research that I read not only talked about trauma, but it talked about the anxiety and those symptoms associated, sharing that they think it's almost 5 in 5, as in every person at some point in time is feeling an increased amount of anxiety. Mr. Nurse, the patient there, he also shared early on when I had a conversation with him that he was still hearing the beeps of the ICU every time he tries to fall asleep at night. And it often worries him and concerns him, especially knowing they have lost their sister-in-law. He survived, she did not. I think that's a little bit of survivor's guilt that he's experiencing. What would you advise in that case?
As I mentioned in the beginning, grieving is really a process, and each person has some natural built-in ability to manage that process. Now, if after a period of time, a person is still experiencing the kind of symptoms that you just described, after a long period of time, inability to sleep, intrusive thoughts, hearing the beeps and that sort of thing, it may indicate the necessity of taking further action to deal with that trauma. And there are methods within the realm of therapy and within the realm of medicine for dealing with trauma. So not to get too much into the technical stuff, but things like there's a particular technique, the acronym is EMDR, that a lot of practitioners who've been trained and who know what they're doing can practice. And it can have the impact of helping a person deal with trauma better and recover the aspects of their life that they lost. So with dealing with trauma, it's really, really important to be brutally honest with yourself and to assess whether you are feeling normal, whether you are not normal, and for how long that has been going for. And according to the established criteria, once you cross a month after the traumatic event, you should be carefully observing what you are feeling, what is different from before the event occurred. And that's the point at which, one should start really assessing how they're doing.
Mr. Joseph, and that is very important. You see, awareness is the cornerstone of any coping mechanism. And as you shared there, being able to identify, being able to recognize what are these trigger points it would probably be the first step in treating or resolving this trauma.
That's right.
Mr. Joseph, before you leave our set right here on the brink, what would be your closing comments to anyone who is viewing, who've been experiencing trauma? How can you help them cope? What mechanisms can they integrate today, tomorrow, that will help them better cope with pandemic grief or any grief that they're experiencing?
Sure. One of the tenets of stress management, which would stretch into trauma and so on, I believe in, is based on the Serenity Prayer, which talks about accepting that there are some things you can't change, there are some things you can, but it's hard to change them, and having the wisdom to know the difference. It's really important to get to a point, either by yourself or with help, where you can accept what has happened. You may get there on your own, you may need help, but that's the point that everybody should be aiming at. And with respect to life, and there's some realities about life, right? Everybody lives and everybody passes away at some point. The only thing that lives on is the legacy we leave behind. So we should live each day thinking about the legacy that we're building and what we want that legacy to be like and what it actually does and will look like. So I think I would leave those words with anyone who is going through this at this point in time.
Thank you so much, Mr. Joseph, for being one of our expert guests right here on The Brink.